Thank you for joining in. Well, my name is Agre Mokua. I'll be your moderator for this session, and welcome all, and thank you for joining in. Well, today we are going to be discussing nutrition in cancer prevention. As you all know, we are gearing up for the cancer month, which is in October, the coming month. So we are preparing ourselves in terms of how do we manage our patients who have cancer, and how can we be able to prevent cancer in the first place. So that will be our topic for today. And our discussion or our presentation is going to be done by none other than our very own Kihugo Angereso, Eric, who is a clinical nutritionist and dietitian at the Kenyatta National Hospital. He has a vast experience in nutrition, medical nutrition management of patients, and with over 11 years of experience. So we're in the right hands to be able to listen in terms of what is key in nutrition as pertains to cancer prevention. And he's worked in several organizations and hospitals around, but currently he's an employee of Kenyatta National Hospital, and he's overseeing he's a student coordinator who is coordinating in terms of the students we usually receive for internships and attachments at the Kenyatta National Hospital. And today we want to welcome him to give us his presentation on nutrition in cancer prevention. So welcome, Mr. Eric, and take us through cancer prevention. So in case of any questions, please type your questions under the tab of questions so that now we can be able to be answered. We can have a Q&A at the end of the session where we'll be able to address all the questions that will be asked. And welcome, Eric.
Thank you very much, Agri, for that wonderful presentation, introduction. As you've already heard, I'll be taking you through the topic nutrition in cancer prevention. And therefore, I suppose we'll have a fruitful discussion. And as already has been said, that you have the opportunity to ask your questions so that we can have an understanding or knowledge sharing experience as pertains to nutrition in cancer management. So cancer is a global problem, and therefore it is prudent that as healthcare workers and the community at large, we put up systems or engage in activities aimed at seeing a reduction in the burden. So as we upload the presentation, feel free to interact, and in case of any clarifications that you may be interested in, of course, as you already said, you can interact with us on the chat. Yeah, so our topic is nutrition in cancer prevention. Now, as an introduction, we find that according to the National Cancer Institute, that is Kenya, They define cancer as when cells divide and produce abnormally and have the potential to spread throughout the body, crowding normal cells and tissues. So as an introduction, Borovich defined that for it to be classified as a cancer, then there's description around abnormal cell division, and therefore spreading or metastasis has to be a characteristic of interest to define it as a tumor or not. And so you'll find that it's a second leading cause of death globally, which in itself now means it's a crisis which we need to work on holistically in seeing the reduction in the numbers. And it's attributed to about 10 million deaths in the year 2020. So in this regard, we find that according to the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IRC, in 2018, about 17 million new cases of cancer were diagnosed. And you see, around the same time, about 9.5 million cancer deaths occurred worldwide during that time. So in a nutshell, it simply means more or less like near 50% of all those new cases that actually are diagnosed, we end up losing them. And therefore, it is prudent that now, as healthcare workers, we look at it in terms of how do we focus on prevention rather than now end up losing the many cases that we end up with, that we diagnose, over time. Now, the bar chart therein reflects the distribution of cancer cases globally. So of interest here is when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, we account for about 21% of the total cases in cancer. So in this case, questions of interest would be now, what would account for the progressive rise in the cases in sub-Saharan Africa, of which, of course, Kenya is part and parcel. So in the same year, 2020, which we talked about earlier, you find that 70% of the mortalities that actually occurred during that time were actually in sub-Saharan Africa. Therefore, of course, meaning as pertains to diagnosis, therefore it means basically there is a rise in the number of cases, but the unfortunate thing also is of the majority that actually tend to succumb to the burden actually also arise in Africa. Now, it's estimated that cancer incidence has doubled in sub-Saharan Africa over the past 30 years. Now, that in itself also is an area of concern that as a country or as a continent, we need to put in place strategies in addressing this burden. Now, although an individual may develop some type of cancer during their lifetime, those diagnosed are living longer than ever. So, of course, in this case, you find that you're saying, in as much as there are some instances whereby there is a rise in the cancer burden, but at times you find that in nations like, say, maybe North America, the prevalence being at 4%, it means possibly now this statement is trying to qualify that yes, you may have a diagnosis around cancer, but then there is also a chance that you may also tend to live longer. And this possibly thanks to the screening and early detection, vaccination, and improvements in treatment. So the Western world, yes, would actually acknowledge that yes, there is advancement in care and early detection. And therefore, possibly, if that's the entry point in which sub-Saharan Africa and Africa at large has to look into, then that's where now possibly resources need to be factored in preventing the spontaneous rise in the scourge of the cancer. So, however, even for cancers with effective treatment options, prevention has greatest potential to reduce the burden in the general population. And that's why, of course, even right from early education years in terms of primary school, we hear words like, say, prevention being better than cure. So that's the same narrative that we need to be looking into as of this moment as pertains to this spontaneous rise in cancer. So we're looking at a poll. So I expect that we have a poll, in which case, of course, we get to see of the listed, what is the perception of the attendees around what common causes of cancer are. So you can vote in. So the question reads, what are the common risk factors for cancer? So you can see what's coming in. Yeah, I think we can stop there for now and possibly have a look at the voting results. So from the poll results, majority, 67%, are of the opinion that cancers are caused by mainly chemicals exposure. 61% are of the opinion that genetics accounts for that. Then 47% believe diet is involved. Radiation at 56%. Viruses 27%, and those who are not sure are at 3%. So from the discussion, basically we'll be looking at now, based on the highlighted alternatives that are potential causes of cancer, then in this case, how are they interrelated as pertains to the discussion at hand? Yeah, so what is being projected is a linkage between diet as pertains to initiation, potentiation, and progression of cancer. You'll find that chemicals, as has already been seen in the poll, are involved. And when we talk about chemicals, basically looking at it in terms of, is it in the food production chain, and therefore exposure, and therefore potential risk in potentiating onset of cancer. Excessive energy. So in this case, we talk about the issue around overweight and obesity. And in which case now you'll find that now that's where now diet is an express link to excess energy and therefore associated to onset of cancer. Now, maybe going back on chemicals, you'll find that if you look at production, in which case now, if you're looking at massive production of food, in which now chemicals are involved in terms of controlling pests or related entities as pertains to optimizing maximum production at the farm level, if these chemicals find themselves in the food chain, then of course now that's where the linkage comes in. But also there is also the issue around the preservation. Once the food has been harvested, now in the area, especially in the area around post-harvest loss management, so the chemical preserves in the context of now after harvesting, upon interaction with the human system, then that's also a potential interaction that now may potentiate the onset of cancer or initiate. But also, when you look at the commercial value addition part of it, in which now the chemicals involved also in preserving these foods. So obviously now, right from production, post-harvest management, now and also in the food value chain, then that's where chemicals form an express link to that effect. Now, excessive energy, of course, now when there is imbalance between energy intake and expenditure, viruses, like say, for instance, HPV, a human papilloma virus, involved, that is associated with the cervical cancers, for example. Then malignant neoplasms. So that also is basically the malignant neoplasm or the cancer itself now may arise from, when you look at the left side, the chemicals, excessive energy, viruses, but now from the right-hand side, where now we have got the limited antioxidants and other nutrients in food, basically you're looking at it in terms of the intake of fruits and vegetables, which have got substantive quantities of carcinoprotective ingredients that actually may help in limiting initiation, promotion, or progression of cancer. Now, radiation, so of course, you realize that under the guise of modernity and globalization, find that we are exposed to different levels and thresholds of radiation. In this case, you find that be it from solar radiation, the other day we had a national conversation around the climate change. So the global warming effect, radiation, therefore, is part and parcel of that. And generally, e-waste as pertains to the electronic gadgets we have, some may tend to be releasing harmful radiations, which of course you're not privy to, and therefore, of course, accounting for the initiation, promotion, progression of cancers in totality. Yeah, so in this case, basically the algorithm is just trying to highlight on the potential link points in which now they associate to outright manifestation of cancer. And that's why it is relatively not easy to single-handedly say a particular food is involved. So it's multivariate. Besides that, of course, you haven't talked about maybe smoking, alcohol, and even now there's another issue, of course, which I haven't talked about here, which is about sin, because sin, you find that even biblically, tumors have been documented vividly as far as human creation is involved. So we'll have a second poll. And you're looking at, does your weight affect risk of developing cancer? Does your weight affect developing risk of cancer? So you can vote in so that now you can have a perspective around how weight can be influencing cancer. We've got 5 seconds to go. I think now you can look at the poll result. So majority, 65% are agreeing that yes, a person's weight has the chance of disposing him or her in developing cancer. About 23%, they are saying no, they are not. Weight is not associated in cancer onset, and then about 12% they are not sure. So, in our subsequent discussions, of course, basically we just want to look at it in terms of how weight can be associated in being linked to cancer. Because maybe if I just take you a while back on the algorithm I shared earlier, you'll find that excessive energy intake, of course, has the chance of contributing to overweight and obesity, and therefore, and that's why the linkage is indicated. Yeah, so what is being projected shows the interlink between diet, nutrition, and the onset of some cancers. So there is level of evidence to show that yes, there is an association. Then there is whether there is the decreased risk, and then whether that evidence also has the potential to show increased risk. So in this case, you find that physical activity has been shown to be involved in decreasing the risk of developing colonic cancers, like say of the colon. But now in this case, overweight and obesity on the other hand, has been shown to be involved in increasing the risk of esophagus, colorectal, breast in postmenopausal women, and even some forms of tumors in kidneys. So aflatoxin in the liver, of course, there's the issue around hepatosteatosis, and then even like say consumption of Chinese style salted fish. Of course, in this case now we're looking at it in terms of overweight and obesity, with this linkage in esophageal cancers, aflatoxin in the context around the association with liver cancers, and then the Chinese salted fish in the onset of nasopharyngeal carcinomas. So when the emphasis around physical activity is put across, basically the aim here is to focus around improving bowel movements and also managing matters weight. But you see now in the context of overweight and obesity with the other forms of, let's say, colorectal cancers, it means now bowel movements become hampered, and therefore, of course, exposure to carcinogens contained therein in food, then of course, they may tend to attack the colonic walls and therefore predisposing matters onset of, let's say, colorectal cancers. Where there is probable chance of involvement, you find that in enhancing decreased risk, fruits and vegetables have been shown to have decreased risk in onset of oral cavity cancers, esophageal cancers, and even colorectal cancers. But mainly in this context, you're looking at now the benefit around the antioxidants therein, and then so besides that, the issue around fiber, which also helps in improving bowel habits and therefore minimizing onset of such forms of cancers. And then increased risk, preserved meat. So of course, in this case, we look at it in terms of like the use of nitrous oxide. Usually in most of these commercial processed meat products, be it tinned or canned, for example, and therefore the preserve therein has been associated in the onset of, let's say, colorectal cancers. Salt, preserved food, and even salt independently has been associated with the onset of stomach cancers. Very hot drinks and food with the onset of, say, oral cavity, pharyngeal, and esophagus. But basically, the express association here is, of course, with the hot fluids or hot drinks or food, they actually tend to like more or less emulsify the lining of fat there that protects the cavity. So of course, with that, it means you expose tissue to express heat or hot conditions, or rather heat, which actually tend now to more or less like scald the lining in the esophagus or in the pharyngeal regions. Possible, or where there is insufficient evidence, is about fiber, soya, fish, carotenoids, vitamin B2, B6, C, D, E, calcium, as in these nutrients have been shown to have a possible benefit, though of course, given the algorithm we discussed earlier on, it's hard to single-handedly now pick an ingredient, because you know, even doing researches on human subjects independently due to ethical issues may actually tend to be a limiting factor to prove association, or that yes, expressly, if you consume a lot of B2 or B6 or folate, C, D, E, and even calcium, would have an express benefit in reducing. So basically, heterocyclic amines happen, especially when you roast the meats. So the charred flesh, like now the black, I mean, once you roast meat, for example, now it has got the char, the dark spots there in the black, I mean, the soot-like kind of, I mean, the overcooked, or, yeah. So it actually produces heterocyclic amines, which by themselves independently contribute or has been linked to malignancy, onset of cancers. Polycystic aromatic hydrocarbons, basically also these ones may come about when you look at it in terms of those guys who who roast, sorry, oh yeah, sorry, I'm told my presentation is not projecting. Yeah, I think you are there. Yeah, so we find that for polycyclic hydrocarbons, basically these ones may happen mainly in the event, for instance, when now you find people burning plastics in the air. So those compounds which now are produced out of such that are contained in the smoke, basically have been associated in that direction of being pro-onset of cancer. And then nitrosamines, basically these are preserves used in, especially in meats. Like for example, we talked about nitrous oxide. And remember at some point there was a concern around some markets or institutions using nitrous oxide to preserve meat for a long time. In their merchandise spots at some time back, and it was a crisis, but we don't know whether now the issue has been arrested solely. Now, we look at the various body segmentations and the potential risk factors associated. So like for stomach cancers, high risk factors are around issues around salty food, salted or dried fish, hot drinks, and food, irregular meals, which of course in this case may produce somebody to like say ulcers. So with ulcers, once now there are some compounds like say now the nitrosamines finding open space in the GI, then obviously now predispose somebody to onset of cancers. Processed carbohydrates, in this case, it means there is likely chance of delayed emptying of your bowels, because now with the minimal fiber therein, it means the bowel movements become staggered. And therefore, of course, if there are any chemicals, be it in the preservation of the particular food or any carcinogens from whatever source that were now like exposed to the GI, delayed emptying means also they are super exposed to the tissue, and therefore now likely chance of triggering tumors. Low risk factors, milk and dairy products, and then raw vegetables and fruits. So basically, in this case, you'll look at it in terms of the fiber and the protective benefits of phytonutrients or antioxidants contained in the fruits and veggies. Colorectal cancer, high-fat diet. So in this case, of course, high-fat diet may mean excessive energy intake, and therefore, of course, overweight and obesity are linked to colorectal cancer. But again, at the same time, also high-fat diet also means delayed or poor emptying of the bowels, and therefore prolonged exposure of carcinogens. The same is tied to low fiber diet, whereby now if food is low in fiber, of course, it takes too long for the waste to come out of the body. That is now in this case long haul, which means independently there is risk of also, of course, as the food ferments longer, then there is a risk of increased fermentation, not fermentation, but rather inflammation. But besides that, also delayed emptying and therefore exposure of carcinogens on the colonic wall, and therefore triggering cancers of the colorectum. So beer, in this case, around rectal cancers, and even now, like say cholesterol, of course, dyslipidemia and such. So fiber-rich foods, in relation to colorectal cancers, we find that fiber-rich diets have been shown to have a chance in minimizing their onset. High biological value protein. So in this case, of course, what you're aiming at here is the more fiber or roughage an individual consumes, then there is the likely chance that the emptying, bowel emptying, it becomes enhanced. And then for the esophagus, consumption of alcohol is an express link to their onset. Hot drinks, food and diet poor in protein, vitamins, and minerals. But then now, of course, consumption of veggies, fruits, and diet rich in vitamins and minerals actually has the potential in seeing a reduction of onset. breast cancer, high fat diet, high calorie or high fat diet. So basically it's about matters of obesity. Cancer of the lung, cholesterol. So basically it's about limited supply of blood, say to the lungs, for example, because with dyslipidemia, it means there is risk of ischemia happening in the lung region. But at the same time, independently, we look at it in terms of individuals who do smoke, between the tar that actually tends to percolate in the lungs now may even tend to exacerbate the onset of the cancer. So basically, the slide highlights possible benefits that arise out of phytochemicals in the onset of various cancers. So like you've got compounds like, say, capsaicin, found in chili pepper, catechins, found in green tea and other beverages, lycopene, benzyl isothiocyanate. So basically, these are now the phytochemicals in food that actually have been shown to have a protective benefit in the prevention of onset of cancers. Because remember also in the algorithm, we looked at it in terms of a diet deficient in phytochemicals also independently has been shown to have a link to onset of cancer. But remember, basically for phytochemicals, their role or function basically is to more or less serve as antioxidants in actually arresting what we would call the oxygen reactive species that has been actually there is a culprit independently in carcinogenesis. So the sources are as highlighted, like say lycopene, tomatoes, papaya, pink guava, red carrots, and therefore, of course, in families, uptake of such options has the potential of seeing a reduction of chance. However, you'll find that when you look at commercial agriculture and what we want here, basically, the focus should be on quality value chain in terms of if the agriculturalists conduct good practice right from production, processing, and maybe harvesting, then you may not actually end up now reversing the benefits attached to the identified items in the presentation. Because you find at times, yes, tomatoes could be, of good benefit as indicated. Though now with an unethical practice as pertains to production, where now you find maybe somebody uses beyond normal doses based on the instruction for production as pertains to control of pesticides, then the likely chance of the excessive dose of the chemical of interest finding itself in the value chain becomes high. And therefore, this actually calls for the need for vigilance by the public health community around whether there is, adequate or tolerable limits as per accepted standards in production. Because you see now, you may also invest now in doing maybe say salads out of the learning you're getting this hour, but then only to find that as pertains to production, then there are gaps around excessive use of chemicals for the purpose of maximizing returns as pertains to production. So in this case, you find that ethical agricultural practices now become paramount in this regard. So that's just a continuation in terms of, like, say, isoflavane or piperlongumine. Basically, these are now additional, phytochemicals and their sources and potential benefits. But now their benefit will remain true if we arrest the issue around agriculture quality in terms of what, and actually the discussion actually here is about food safety. Because now if food safety is a problem, then of course now it may tend to counter the benefits that phytochemicals may tend to provide in our diets. So what is projecting basically is just a summary of the potential phytochemicals that serve as antioxidants in our bodies and whose main sources basically are from fruits and vegetables. And therefore, variety and diversity, of course, is the encouragement which now we advocate for, that you get the benefit of each of those based on the diverse foods that supply them. So if you're to look at prevention, then Our first entry point is about energy balance, and that's why when we talked about in the algorithm around whether overweight and obesity is part and parcel of onset of cancers, from the background of the discussion, we've seen basically excessive energy intake with the minimal exercise has been also been associated with some forms of cancers. And that's why it's important, it becomes one of the entry points of concern. So some cancer risk factors such as genetics and environment are out of your control, because at times you find that you may not change your genetics, but of course also, well, there is something you can do about the environment as pertains to waking up to the call of combating climate change. But research suggests that about 70% of your lifetime risk of cancer is within your power of change. So possibly genetics and environment may actually play around 30%, but then 70%, which now is what actually is at your discretion as a person to change or modify environment based on what is being projected there. Like in the case of like energy balance, it's your responsibility as a person to work out fat intake, of course, consumption of the healthy options based on the advice from nutritionists or dietitians, protein intake, fiber, fruits and vegetables. Yes, so in this case, avoiding cigarettes, for instance, is at the discretion of a person, limiting alcohol intake, reaching a healthy weight, and getting regular exercise are all steps for preventing cancer. So adopting a healthy diet can also play a vital role, like in the context now of energy balance. And then besides that, also in this case, of course, you are aiming at now managing or containing obesity, because even just besides obesity being associated with cancer, you find that the other non-communicable diseases, like in this case, say diabetes, hypertension, talk of also arthritis and other multiple non-communicable diseases, which independently overweight and obesity has been a culprit in. So energy balance and exercise, each 5 kg increase in weight gain during adulthood has been seen to significantly be associated with a 16% high risk of endometrial cancers and 6% higher risk of postmenopausal breast cancer. So a 5 kg increase in adulthood. Of course, you're not saying a situation whereby possibly a person has edema. Edema is not part of now what they're counting. Basically, literally in the context of gaining weight independently, about 5 kgs, I mean, has 16% chance of association with endometrial cancers and 6% chance of postmenopausal breast tumors. Now, fat in this case, you're looking at it in terms of heating. So in as much as, yes, there could be healthy fats and oils in the market, but now the only enemy that comes on board is the heating temperature. So overheating independently has the chance of seeing the production, or I mean, the conversion or the formation of what we call aldehydes. Aldehydes, basically now, those are now the express culprits that have been seen in carcinogenesis. Also, there is the issue around heterocyclic amines when you talk about now roasting of meats, and then polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which also have been culprits in the onset of cancers, especially now when people now choose to ban waste plastics in the name of cleaning the environment. So protein concern here is basically the preservatives involved. So mainly you find that the use of nitrous oxide, for example, is now independently now the express chemical that has been a culprit in the onset of tumors, especially now, like say tumors of the stomach or colorectal segments. Or now basically now preserves for if it's fresh, or also for the canned alternatives in terms of protein, the canned meats are related, maybe even now are they to be beet legumes and even now the meats. So the canning, what keeps these proteins long term, the issue of interest, basically the preserves, of which now nitrous oxide is the culprit. So basically, in as much as preservation is an element around assuring food safety, food security, for the long term, because you see now when there is abundance of harvest, and then of course preservation and therefore value chain addition is of paramount interest. But we find that now the issue around those adherence as per like say what regulators like maybe CABs have in place, if they're not adhered to, then now safety now outweighs security as per se. And then fiber. So fiber basically, be it from whole grain carbohydrates, basically the aim here is in improving matters bowel movements, so that now, because they tend to like improve or rather enhance emptying, gastric emptying, which means in case there are any carcinogens contained in food, they are eliminated faster now. So the same can be achieved, yes, from fruits and vegetables, but now of interest in the fruits and vegetables, basically look at it in terms of what we'd call the phytochemicals that we discussed earlier on. So in alcohol context, of course, independently alcohol, of course, it will affect your exercise regimen. Then number two, alcohol, of course, will actually affect your eating habits, because you see now, wherever one is outside home, wherever they'll actually be taking the alcohol from, whatever food is served may be out the recommendations as pertains to matters healthy eating. Of course, most often than not, you may find it won't be, whole grain flour, maybe if they were to do ugali outside, but most often than not, it will be sifted or processed alternatives, which means independently, intake of fiber shall have been reduced. Number two, you said also processed carbohydrates also have the chance of also improving, accelerating episodes of constipation, which means now delayed gastric emptying and therefore inflammation issues. And then, of course, alcohol gives you empty calories, which also independently we also see an increase in over matters of obesity. Besides that, also you also find alcohol independently, of course, it involves, it matters dehydration, that is. Of course, anybody, alcohol, beer intake, for example, we'll see a person go for short call several times. It reduces somebody to dehydration. So dehydration, therefore, in this case, independently means there'll be delayed, poor elimination of wastes arising out of either the metabolization of alcohol, detoxifying of the alcohol by the liver, or any other metabolites that the body produces in terms of waste removal. So matters limited hydration, therefore, of course, that's now how alcohol is linked to matters onset of cancer. And of course, also preservation of the same alcohol, the chemical preserves, which of course, in this case, risk may be escalated based on the dose of somebody consumes and how often he or she does. Environment, in this case, of course, it means, does it facilitate matters eating, food choices? Does it also affect physical activity and exercise for that matter? Now, for coffee and tea, the key word here is dehydration. Of course, with dehydration, as earlier explained, you find that the body will lose more fluids or water, which is essential for other physiological functions. So in this case, that loss independently will see buildup of toxins in the body, independently now predisposing to the risk of concern. The preserves therein in the production of coffee and tea. The temperature, in this case now, as pertains to, remember we mentioned something around hot drinks or food. So the temperature, it means if you live, for example, in a cold area, and therefore now you would rather take hot beverages to quail the cold, then there are chances of scalding along the oral cavity, the esophagus, and related segments. So that scalding, of course, exposes tissue to either bacterial or viral attack. But besides that, also, we find that as the body is struggling to heal, but there is also some progressive, scalding, which means now sorry. Yeah. So matters around coffee, tea, and it's about matters dehydration. But again, also temperature of those drinks, basically the scalding effect, and therefore exposing tissue to viral or bacterial attacks. And now, in this case, potentiating onset of matters, onset of cancer, be it of the esophagus, gastric, or maybe or pharyngeal. So the accompaniment in this case, basically, it's about what are you eating alongside. So for instance, yes, you'll be taking a cup of coffee, but at the same time also with the processed carbohydrates. So which means also generally your fiber or roughage intake is low, and therefore enhancing chance of onset of matters over to obesity. But beside that, at the same time, constipation issues, and therefore inflammation, and therefore risk of development of colorectal or related cancers in this case. Artificial sweeteners, basically, this is a problem, especially in the population around diabetic patients, who, especially now, for those ones who've been asked not to use sugar based on their diagnosis, now they find it to be an alternative. But we find that, be it in the US, in the UK, there has been controversies around their use. And therefore, in this case, you find that some have been shown to have carcinogenic effect. But that's why if there is conflicting information pertaining to whether to use or what not to use, remember the interest of the manufacturer is way beyond the discussions or the debates that actually health workers get involved in. So in this case, we find that besides independently being linked to matters around onset of cancer, you find that sweeteners independently will improve the taste of food. So in this case, in as much as this person wanted to control his or her sugars, of course, better taste actually has the chance of improving or affecting how much they eat. Independently matters weight gain. But for those ones now matters glucose control. Of course, glucose control will be hampered because now eating based on what you like and therefore eating more of that particular food will eventually also independently affect the amount of glucose that will actually manifest in your blood. So artificial sweeteners, besides just the entity or around improving taste, it has the ripple implication of course, affecting portions because independently somebody is convinced this is not sugar, but in totality, a concern given the linkage in being pro-cancer. Nitrates, of course, we talk about this as pertains to preservation of meats. Nitrite, the same. Nitrosamines, the same. Of course, those are the three compounds of interest, especially used in preservation of meats, be it canned, and therefore they have been culprits in being pro-carcinogenesis. Method of food preparation. So you'll find that this is of interest given that you find if you fry, then it means there is, and also frying, yes, at high temperatures. Of course, that's routine in most homes. You find that as long as somebody is frying, even the neighbor can be able to tell because of the smell that rises out of the kitchen. So in this case, for as long as heating of fat at high temperatures has taken place, then there is the issue around formation of aldehydes. Aldehydes, which are now expressed candidates, as Ali explained, in being pro-carcinogenesis. So that's why if you would steam maybe or boil, as in methods that require minimal, of course, use of fat. Of course, you need fat and oil for the purpose of vitamin A, D, and K. But of course, the recommendation can be if you are to fry one item, then it means you'll actually, out of the 3 items on your plate, then it means you actually have reduced risk of aldehydes by nearly a third. So maybe I can steam my vegetables, boil my rice, and then fry my beef. In this case, it means I've minimized the amount of oil I use because now heating temperature basically, even if is the high quality oil as one may allude, heating actually tends to bring about matters hydrogenation. Besides that, also formation of aldehydes, which are now culprits in the discussion at hand. Then there is the issue around chemoprevention. Chemoprevention basically is about advocacy for increased consumption of fruits and vegetables so that now one can benefit from the benefits attached to phytochemicals in them. Now, the diagram highlighted or rather displayed is trying to show more or less like a composite holistic change recommendations by the American Institute for Cancer Research in terms of how can we prevent cancer. So it highlights actually 10 steps as entry points of interest. And in this case, of course, as we discussed earlier, there is the issue around weight. Be of a healthy weight. So in this case, of course, this is best determined when you basically do a body mass index. So like given your age or rather your height, what is the desired weight for your height? So in this case, it actually is a rapid tool in just being able to put you into check in terms of, do I have the desired weight? And therefore, by just achieving that bullet on healthy weight, it means basically you are on the verge of progressive cancer prevention. Be physically active. So that's actually to emphasize on the role of exercise. So in doing the exercise bit of it, remember we talked about matters helping in preventing overweight and obesity. But number 2 is also therapy in stress relief. And then number 3, of course, exercise independently helps in improving our bowel habits. And therefore, as you empty your bowels, it means now you're minimizing exposure of any carcinogens contained in food into your colonic wall, and therefore they are flushed out before being of harm to the body. Of course, prolonged stay of long call independently has the chance of triggering matters GI inflammation, and therefore predisposing to a raft of complications long term. Then there is the issue around limit consumption of red and processed meat. So in this case, remember, when we talk about consumption, you're looking at it in terms of especially processed in the context around the preserves involved. So we talked about the nitrites, nitrates, and nitrosamines, which have been implicated in cancer. And then, of course, remember, besides just the preserves, you'll also find that conventionally, nearly everybody of interest, once they're on any meat for that purpose, you'll find most circumstances, the preparation method will be frying. And of course, remember, the better the taste, the more he or she is likely to eat, independently also contributing to matters of weight and obesity. And then there is the issue around limiting consumption of sugar-sweetened drinks. So in this case, of course, in some way, one would say the increase in the sugar prices in the country is an express, return, positive return out of the complaint of the many. But of course, of interest here is sugar is an express enticer of taste. So of course, better taste affects the portions and therefore risk of matters of obesity. And then alcohol consumption. And the express word here is ideally you don't need to. But of course, limiting can be relative. But in this case, of course, as per the explanations mentioned earlier, that alcohol consumption, the environment involved, the physical activity, the empty calories you get out of it, it exposes to matters of obesity, besides the preserves involved in keeping them on the shelf lives. And then there is the issue around eating a diet rich in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and vegetables. Basically, in this case, you're looking at it in terms of one, whole grain carbohydrates, the fiber, and therefore improved bowel habits, and therefore also helping in checking our energy intake, and therefore limiting or preventing matters of obesity. But then, of course, so the fiber, improving bowel habits, and also the fruits and veggies, basically the phytochemicals have or they serve the role of matters being antioxidants in addressing or in combating onset of cancer independently. There is also the issue around limiting consumption of fast foods. Of course, in the name of modernity and convenience, or one would call them convenience foods. The unfortunate thing is, if one is found with a pack with a label from one of the perceived top-notch vendors of fast foods, they presume to be living large, but the unfortunate thing is they are living low on the contrary. So ideally, consumption of fast foods, in this case, of course, the issues of interest are, one, the sugar, the fat, and the salt involved in their making, which means better taste bias and therefore convincing conviction that you'd rather go for more. And maybe depending on how nicely they become packaged, then one is likely to be convinced to even go for a second helping. Or even now, in fact, we are having situations whereby now you can now order online for such, But you see now, in as much as it's convenience, let it this convenience inconvenience you in time to come. And then about breastfeeding, for mothers, breastfeed your baby if you can. So of course, matters related to now preventing onset of, say, cancers of the breast. Now, of course, that's the role of the benefit of an express benefit of breastfeeding. It also helps in preventing onset, let's say, cancers of the breast. And then there is the issue around the use of supplements. You'll find that out of fear, people now perceive that now it's better because their diets are deficient, out of perception that of these nutrients of interest, then they'd rather go for supplements, but rather do not use supplements in preventing cancer, but rather aim to get nutrition advice on the best way to prevent by adopting a healthy diet to that effect. But again, also in the event, for instance, one has been diagnosed, then it's also important now, for instance, now to follow recommendations as pertains to the treatment adopted. So these recommendations actually are based on the continuous update of by the institute, that is the American Institute of Research. And of course, they are aiming at to promote a lifestyle consisting of healthy dietary pattern, physical activity, and weight management. And of course, remember, these three are part of what I said, 70% of the cancers actually can be prevented. Can be prevented by virtue of you as a person taking the initiative to work on the preventables that you are discussing at this hour. So this actually, the physical activity, dietary pattern, and weight management may not only help reduce the risk of cancer, but may also contribute to the prevention of obesity and other chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes. In this case, of course, which we said, besides just matters cancer and weight, remember also obesity can also predispose somebody to diabetes and even hypertension. So in a nutshell, those 10 points serve as link points of interest in holistic change to see a person be on the verge of minimizing chance of exposing self to cancer. So in a nutshell, we would say no single food can protect against cancer by itself. So you wouldn't say, for instance, you are chasing after some grass or some seed or some fruit or whatever nature. So that now in this context, to help in preventing cancer. So in this case, you find that holistic change diet-wise serves as the entry point in addressing the burden. Then diet and nutrition are important factors in cancer prevention. So of course, from the discussion, you realize that even from the voting you had, actually about 47% were of the agreement that yes, cancer can be prevented through diet. Yes, so prevention is possible, of course, once you put into consideration what we've discussed. But either way, still we are encouraging on matters early nutrition screening, so that now you can be able to capture your risk profile around matters overweight and obesity and education, so that in this case you make early changes, not only now in preventing cancer, but rather any other non-communicable diseases that actually are affecting at all on public health in the country and the world at large. So I think with that, I can call it a day. But then, of course, the floor is now open for any questions of interest. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much, Eric, for that elaboration and a very elaborate presentation.
Yeah.
Well, we have a few questions that need to be addressed. And I think I'll start with the first one from Tonui. And I believe you must have addressed it. He was asking about how does the temperature of the food and beverages relate to the malignancies, which I believe through the presentation you are able to answer it. Well, the second person, Joseph, was asking about what are the best sources of high fiber contents foods, that is, I believe so.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. But I suppose also towards the end of the discussion, we talked about the role of fruits and vegetables. Any vegetable within your reach will actually help you in achieving intake. And that's why now blanketly, as part of the recommendation, we now emphasize, the emphasis is on at least having half of your plate vegetables. So in this case, they bulk up much of your tummy. So now you also feel full longer. Besides that, also you find that the fruits and vegetables, the fruits, of course, based on what is in season around you, or any fruit that you come across within your locality can serve as a substantive source for that. Now, of course, for the starches or carbohydrates, we find that the recommendation is any unprocessed. For instance, now, if you are to go and do packet unga for like in making ugali, that is now for flour for ugali, then it means the fiber content therein is low or nearly none at all. But now when you go to the posture mill and have it milled as grade 2, as in whole minus any processing taking into effect, then of course in this case the fiber will be realized. So in this case, if you do whole grain cereals, maybe for flour, if you do like say the roots and tubers, like say cassava, yam, arrowroots, you do pumpkin, all those account for the holistic sources of carbohydrates. So the word here is limited. The more processed food item is, then the higher the chances that now it has minimal fiber therein.
Thank you for that elaborate answer. There is another question from Wamai Onjoy. He's asking, are there minimum values for alcohol intake? Hot foods or drinks are promoted in pH as food safety measures. Any comments?
So the question around whether there are maximum values for alcohol intake, you'll find that recommendations around whether to or not to take alcohol are actually skewed to industry. So industry, you see now there is the paradox around why does maybe somebody drink? You see, if you go from that perspective, drinking is subject to personal dynamics. And therefore, you'll find that at times, maybe in a nutshell, one could be looking at drinking as a scapegoat to hide from a reality. But at the end of it all, once now the hangover sets in, the reality still sets in. So usually conventionally now we talk about, a bottle for a man and two bottles for a man and one for a woman. But ideally, that recommendation is purely skewed to accommodating industry interests, but not matters public health as pertains to human living. So you see the irony around it is looking at now alcohol environment vis-a-vis now the issues around the preserves, the food environment around when now you're doing the alcohol. Of course, somebody may also say now, what about if I do it from my house? Remember, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So you may start by sipping, but eventually now you become a guzzler out of now what we'd call addiction. And this case now talk about rehabilitation. So in this case, ideally, if you can go without, keep it up. So hot foods and drinks are promoted in public health as safety measures. Now, it should not be hot. It should actually be room temperature or maybe lukewarm. Because hot, remember, we talked about the issue around scalding. Of course, you may warm the food at high temperatures. It cools down to tolerable temperatures at the time you want to eat. But you see now, if you take it hot, of course, the scalding effect that will actually happen in your cavity is what now becomes a threat in predisposing your oral cavity, or maybe, I mean, the esophageal region, the rest, as in, you more or less like melt the gelling effect of saliva that actually lines the colonic wall, or maybe now right from the esophageal. So in this case, once it's melted, it means now you expose the tissue to pathogenic attacks, besides also the scalding that there is hot temperatures. Because hot food means once it lands into your mouth, then the cold tissue, that now the oral cavity will tend to absorb that heat. Now it's more or less like you're cooking your own oral cavity, and therefore eventually the risks we are discussing.
Well, there is Bahati, who is saying, kindly clarify which fruits, because majority of the fruits are filled with fructose, which does not induce insulin directly and cause prolonged higher blood sugar levels after their consumption, which results in insulin resistance and thus obesity. So both of which are a risk factor for cancer. Kindly be very specific about the fruits, especially the fructose in them.
Now, that's a very interesting question. You'll find that as a blanket public health communication, diversity is the emphasis. That you don't majorly work with purpose by virtue of you've heard from this discussion that their fructose count is low. Because you see now, in as much as they may have carotenoids and maybe plenty of vitamin A, remember now there is an alternative substitute, or maybe they could be out of season. So it does not mean you go importing purpose by virtue of the endorsement you may have had from this. But the word here is diversity in the categories. Now, linking matters around fructose and obesity, you find that there are individuals, so it's not about the fruits that actually they are the trigger point, but rather these are individuals who are likely to, like, say, in the context of their being overweight or obese, they want to react to their circumstance, as in they're assuming as though they gained this weight yesterday. So instead, what they choose to do is now more or less like on a starvation diet, in which case they like substitute main meals, like say lunch, for example, even dinner, and say they just want to do fruits. So you'll find that in this case, the body goes into an energy conservation mode because it presumes as though you are starving. So independently, the next time you eat, whatever energy you get out of it, you keep on packing, therefore accounting for the progressive weight gain. Remember also, in the next encounter with food, there is likely chance that you may also tend to compensate for the miss outs in the name of, I think I've not eaten anything and only eat once in a day. So that expressly can actually overwhelm the pancreas in matters around the amount of insulin required to shrink down the emanating glucose out of this mountain or small hill you'll have cleared at one sitting. So that's now what may now be the express linkage around why insulin resistance, and now it's cheaper for you to associate them with the fruits. Yet remember, there is also a background of other interplay factors whereby in the event the body assumes you're starving, it borrows from your fat stores. The moment you eat, you reimburse with some markup, eventually seeing you gain weight. And this actually now make account for what we'd call either obesity in the context of cell hypertrophy, meaning the cells increase in size to accommodate more energy to survive longer, or hyperplasia, meaning now more cells are produced to serve as pockets for storing energy because they understand that you keep on borrowing too much out of their pockets. Now, look at the example around maybe if you're running a kiosk and by mid-month you've already sold all the sugar that you had, it means you're going to restock. You'll actually go beyond your minimum stock level. So now you don't run out of sugar any other time. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for that. There is someone else who was asking a question on, it was more or less to, I believe you already answered part of it. There was someone else who was asking about what is our take on the antioxidants for patients, like the therapy, which I want to tie that question together with someone who was asking about the something to do with omega-3, which is heavily being promoted by manufacturers and allegedly being sold as if it has many advantages. So what is your take on it?
Come again?
when there's an issue about omega-3 supplements,
Mm.
and which are being heavily promoted by manufacturers and alleged to have many advantages, which I wanted you to address together with the question on the issues to do with antioxidants for patients. What is your take in terms of the antioxidants for patients on chemotherapy?
Now, I think that's a good question. Now, you find that although now it's under the domain around management, but of course, we will still address it. Now, omega-3 is, when you look at the functions, is mainly around anti-inflammatory. But now, when you supplement, it means also you may go beyond the threshold levels that may counter the benefits of omega-6. So don't look at omega-3 in isolation, because remember now, actually, usually in the body requires a near ratio of about 1:1. For every molecule of omega-3, there is also a molecule of omega-6, which of course, omega-6 is pro-inflammatory, but then now omega-3 comes in to counter that. Now, if you increase on the dose of omega-3 circulating, then you suppress the available omega-6. Of course, there is the ripple benefit of having countered or rather suppressed inflammation. But remember also, omega-3 has a role in provoking the body's immune response to infection. So meaning if the body was to fight any given infection, but now the activator agent has been suppressed, therefore it means now it becomes counterproductive. And therefore now the intended benefit in anti-inflammation, you don't look at anti-inflammation in isolation. Omega-6 also has an independent role in triggering, or like more or less like as a key to the body's immune response to any infection or invading pathogen in the body. So more omega-3 in circulation, then you suppress the benefits attached to omega-6. So supplementation may be not to be necessary in this regard. Therefore, at times you find industry may ride on lack of, understanding of context for the commercial, interest. Now, in the context around antioxidants, of course, you talked about now, of course, you don't supplement basically. And that's why I talked about when you look at the algorithm towards the end, they talked about no need for supplementation. You see, even if you are to give antioxidants, if the person has not eaten enough. You see, in the cancer context, you remember, most of the issues of concern are, yes, reduced appetite and therefore reduced intake. So with the reduced intake, obviously, yes, there could be need for supplementing. But now if you give antioxidants alone, they become non-productive. Because remember, for them also to be active at cell site, they have to have energy, which the person should have eaten enough during their lifetime. So that's why at times you may find that in managing cancer, in some way, we become reactive to circumstance rather than now being holistic right from the initiation of treatment, so that now collectively as a multidisciplinary team, we can be able now to avert circumstances that actually will see near technical, we'll see technicalities, which at times, even if you are to do supplementation, the benefits are minimal. So, the approach here best is multidisciplinary approach at diagnosis all through as you take the patient through the journey of care, then you're able to avert matters around the dynamics that actually see a reduction in quality of life. Remember now, even from the statistics I shared earlier, nearly like half of all the diagnosed cases, we lose them. And now, basically, these are pointing to the fact that likely chance there is a gap in the continuum of care. Because you see, there are some conditions, maybe like say maybe HIV, at times I would also say maybe diabetes, where there is near chronology in care. Like you've seen a clinician now you have to see a nutritionist, a social worker, psychotherapist. So once there is near programmed care, at times high risk groups can be addressed young and therefore help in minimizing complications that actually make treatment near challenge. So don't jump into supplementation. Understand circumstance, and therefore you'll be good to go.
Okay, there's one question from, actually two, from Sarah Obara. she's asking, can you discuss something on what is known as feeding the tumor? Is it a myth or reality? And the second question is, share with us one ethical conflict in nutrition and cancer management.
Now, I think for the first one, thank you, Sarah. The first one on feeding the tumor, well, it depends on how the discussion can be based on, remember now in the discussion we talked about diet being involved in initiation of cancer, promotion or rather progression or potentiation of the cancer. So potentiation now is where now you're talking about the issue around feeding. Remember, if you're to do electroscopy, now this is especially now in this case, just give an example around maybe you should give processed carbohydrates or sugar independently. You'll find that if you do electroscopy of tumor cells now, which have been done, which now sugar has been put as a medium for which now they need to feed, you'll find that tumor cells are more rapidly active where there is idle, or rather where there is sugar that actually helps in exacerbating their multiplication. Of course, it becomes controlled because at times people now may not see the express link around why I should stop using sugar for the purpose of managing my cancer. But you see now, number one, feeding the tumor, if there is excess energy independently, as in somebody, physical activity is poor, so there is idle energy. Remember, cancer cells require energy to grow. Now, the rate of replication depends on how fueled they become. So that's why at times you may say no sugar in cancer patients, in part by virtue of around feeding the tumor. But number two, you'll find that treatment of cancer patients, they also are on what we'd call anabolic agents. So in this case now steroids, which independently also can actually trigger matters insulin resistance and therefore drug-induced diabetes. So by saying no sugar, it doesn't mean now you are looking at now feeding the tumor independently. You're also looking at it in terms of drug effect interaction as pertains to holistic health of these individuals. And that's why more often than not, along the continuum of care, a cancer patient at some point, of course, the immunity is already suppressed. So if there is any idle glucose, leave alone now even in the GI, maybe and you see most of these patients, they'll come with the, these fruit juices, be it, the juices mainly, be it Ribena or whatever branding in the name of being sick, but the express ingredient therein is sugar. So with somebody who has got, like, say, maybe ulcers independently, and therefore they pour sugar in their gut. So of course, any microorganism surviving therein will actually find express energy to thrive on. In this case, of course, that's why infections become near express. So by saying feeding the tumor, focus area is sugar independently, sugar as sugar. But number two, processed carbohydrates, which also see release of glucose express into circulation, and therefore affecting holistic health. Now, on the question around conflict, she said, share with us one ethical conflict in nutrition and cancer management. That one, I'm not really sounding clear in terms of really what has to come out of this. But of course, you'll find that at times, out of the limited knowledge of the caregiver, the perception that, say, for example, wheatgrass is anti-cancer, then of course, me, I will look at it from another perspective. Because see, patients, for as long as now they believe that wheatgrass is anti-cancer, they'll actually tend to drink those concoctions in the name of actually healing. But remember, on my perspective, actually, they'll actually have hydrated more. Because also remember, it's not the cancer that kills, but the toxicity buildup therein in their body that actually now tends to, to have more damage than benefit. So in this case, it's cheaper for industry players to consider, or individuals, maybe healthcare workers, for example, to out of maybe an understanding of context, to prescribe what I would call supplements with the hype attached to them by the producer or the manufacturer, But of interest here is let's focus on multidisciplinary approach in treatment while understanding or encouraging the patient on what they need to deliver on rather than what will actually be like a bullet in their crisis. Yes.
Thank you very much for the response. There's another compliment and future sessions that are to be held. There's one Evelyn who's suggesting that we should also discuss on liver failure, pancreatitis, and hyperkalemia, which will be done in due course. Thank you for that. There's one called Esther Kanyi. She's asking about herbs, whether cumin seeds, hibiscus, and cinnamon reduce the risk of getting cancer.
Well, I think I talked about what we call phytochemicals. Now, when you put the cumin seeds, you dilute the message, because at times now it's cheaper for individuals now to pursue that direction, like in the era of quail eggs, which I don't know now what happened around that subject. But now in this case, basically, let me say, depending on where you use them. For instance, I may use cinnamon in my tea, or not my tea, but in my water, or whatever form of food I've prepared, with the interest of improving on its palatability. Be it water, if now it tastes better, it means now I've hydrated. So meaning I've improved on my hydration status, but not in isolation independently, that I was trying to address matters around cancer. So look at the benefit of phytochemicals in the area around one, you must have at least one, you are physically fit in terms of your daily weight. You exercise every day, you hydrate adequately, and then you consume fruits and veggies in portions recommended as per the discussion at hand. So in this case, look at the continuum holistic, not singling out, like say cumin seeds independently. Look at how cumin seeds will improve on my water. Like maybe, like for instance, instead of like say salting my food, I would use lemon or ginger or garlic to improve on the taste of food, which means in this case, I've arrested palatability concerns, but at the same time also, my food looks, still can taste. Yeah, so single-handedly picking on phytochemicals or ingredients among different food alternatives can serve a minimum benefit. So look at it holistically as per the outline we had presented on in preventing cancer.
Thank you very much for the response. There's a compliment from Mrs. Warento. Thank you for joining us today. Excellent presentation. My question is in regard to whole maize. Whole maize meal flour is in relation to cancer. I believe the maize is preserved with some chemicals to prevent spoilage. When people buy, they do not wash them. Instead, they take them for milling and use them for ugali. Is there a relationship between milled whole maize, unga wa mahindi, wa kusaga, which is grade 1, I presume, with an increased cancer prevalence in Kenya?
That's an excellent question, because you'll find that that now trickles to what I'd said earlier in the discussion, matters around the dynamics in the food value chain. Because you'll find that in as much as, yes, there was control in production, but then now, as a country, we've been from a crisis whereby now maize has been like gold in most households, which more or less is like a staple. So you find that even if, yes, you are to buy independently and wash, but how about now those ones who didn't wash and now they milled and packaged? So that's why bodies of interest, like say now KEBS and maybe Ministry of Health, need to come on board hands-on to help in containing the likely chance of spillage. So that's why I said earlier, it's now no longer around matters food safety or the food security. The question or the monster in the house at this hour is food safety, which again now, as Ms. Warento has clearly alluded, that we have concerns around as to whether what was even milled went through the right processing channels before it reaches our tables. Because at times you've heard of situations whereby the government, maybe KEBS is destroying maize laced with the aflatoxin. How about those ones that also get back in the chain? Remember the sugar context also. So you see, despite the quantities that was intercepted, also there was some bulk that also had already circulated. So that's why it brings us to the issue around the ethical interest in humanity. And therefore, as I said, onset of cancer is seen. Maybe possibly if you sinned in that direction now, of course, pray that God does not whip you in that direction. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, last but not least, we have 2 more questions to go. What is your take on white meat in regard to cancer management? Is it healthy, or is there any way that is counteracted with the tumor? This is a question from Jackie.
Now, good question. Remember, Jackie, in as much as we talked about limiting intake of red meat, well, conventionally we find that, especially for the West, the level of production of red meat is progressively advanced, meaning also there is the issue around preservation, and therefore in this case, of course, finding its way into the food chain for matters around addressing food insecurity. But you'll find that in the issue around white meat, if you rear by self, it means minimum chance of risk. But you see now also, if you also do commercial feeds in the free range chicken, you also now counter the benefit attached. Now, look at it also in terms of industry, like say now, I'm talking about now those who go for convenience foods. Repeated heating of oil in preparing this white meat, although it was healthy in quotes based on what the recommendation is, but now you are also deep-frying it and repeatedly using the very same oil to cook the same white meat in quotes, the benefits shrink. It's more or less now they become counterproductive. Because remember I said something around aldehydes being pro-carcinogenesis. So in this regard, it actually depends on, as I said, how to prepare. I would rather now, maybe I can grill my chicken. Yes, of course, I will even make chicken stew, steam my cabbage, and then boil my ugali. In this case, I'll have reduced any risk of concern that could be in the direction of being pro-cancer, rather than, yes, it was white meat, but fried. Yes, I was doing cabbage, but also fried. I was also doing rice. The unfortunate thing is also it was processed and again also fried, which means from the energy perspective, that food is rich in energy. From the context around fiber, possibly also it will be low grade, because at times you may find people in the houses doing 1 or 2 tablespoons on the plate as veggies, or some are like, even my kid don't like vegetables. So it's all about logistics, and therefore, of course, it requires a hands-on guidance from a dietitian to that effect. Daisy?
Yes, Daisy, the last question. She's asking, can sugar from fruits, honey, and vegetables exacerbate the multiplication of cancer cells as well?
Now, a very interesting question, but I suppose from what we had answered earlier on, it's more or less interlinked. But remember, we said, why would you do honey, for example, in your food? Of interest is to improve taste. And therefore, look at the projectile direction of it is better taste, more portions. And then more portions, of course, now overweight and obesity cannot be arrested. But of course, assuming also you are eating, yes, I would call it healthy. You've got the carbohydrates. You're not skipping meals, you have a healthy eating plan, but still now using the mentioned in doses beyond required. Because even if it's about fruits and veggies, there is a tolerable or recommended allowance or servings in a day. So in this case, you find that any empty or idle energy therein now can actually find itself. Because remember, I said earlier in the context around feeding the tumor is about energy, and therefore cancer energy cells are also, just like any other cells, require energy to grow. And therefore, of course, the more idle there is energy, therefore, of course, it will actually serve the purpose and intended for this case. Yes, so
thank you very much, our HOD. Very well done. A wonderful presentation and very knowledgeable presenter and moderator. Thank you for the compliments.
there was something on GMO.
Yes, a question from Bahati J. He's asking what of GMOs and cancer? Is it more ethical? Is it a more of an ethical issue, monopoly and control around GMOs than the casual relationship with cancer?
Well, a good question. Remember, when you talk about GMOs, remember of interest here is from a layman's perspective, remember every food is programmed, and therefore our systems are also adapted to how the diets have been conventionally. Therefore, at times, yes, there is risk of misinterpretation that the body now may assume this to be something outside what has been norm, and therefore potentiating risk of concern as per your as you just raised. But at the same time, look at it this way. In the arena around GMOs, remember, it's about food security blanket. So what we would call in Swahili that bora chakula. But of interest you're discussing here is chakula bora. So bora chakula, in this case, it means there is issues around ethics in the production and the value chain. Production, in this case, it means, yes, you will have plenty of produce. So pesticides have been involved in the production and the rest of such. The question is safety, whether the same food at the table from farm to fork, whether it is safe from any residue of what was used in production. Now, besides production, look at storage for the purpose of shelf life, because whenever there will be plenty of production, then there will also be need for keeping it over, for future use, like just what Madam Aurento had already mentioned earlier. So the amount used and the threshold and the user in terms of how after use, once this food has been retrieved for use, after, how is it handled prior to reaching the table? Yes, so now for those who do value chain, what do they use for the shelf life, for example, to sustain use in other periods beyond now? So in this case, about the ethical context, yes, is real around, because everybody will want to maximize on outputs given the cost of production. Yeah, and again, of course, you'll find that in as much as the economy may not allow, then it's easier for people to go for what will see minimum losses irrespective of the cost. So yeah, ethics is the word of concern long term. Yeah, so I think we can stop there for now.
Yes, we thank you for the compliments and for listening today. We look forward to you joining us the next session, which will be on cancer, but this time it will not be on prevention, but rather on management. The session date and time will be shared in due course. Thank you so much for joining us.